Hey, everybody, you're listening to or watching. You're watching the Best Advice Ever, the show where people come on and talk about the best advice they ever got. Today, we have Xeon Lights. Xeon Lights was a guest on the Naked Diner podcast, episode 164, I believe. I'm going to be lazy, and I'm just going to read what's on her Twitter handle because it's very descriptive. It's science communicator, author of The Ultimate Guide to Green Parenting, TEDx speaker, and Extinction Rebellion editor of the Hourglass. Xeon, how are you doing today?
Yeah, I'm good, thank you. How are you?
I'm doing pretty good. Yeah, so how's the rebellion doing?
Everybody is in regenerative mode after 2 weeks on the streets, taking some time out, and a lot of the circles have like a skeleton crew running, so like the social media and stuff is just really essential. We did put out a post about it actually, just that people really need a bit of downtime before we continue with the work.
Right. I believe I've been following Extinction Rebellion on Facebook. And I've heard murmurs that there's going to be a winter rebellion.
Everything at the moment is just being discussed, nothing concrete at the moment. It depends over here on the election, because there's one just being called this is very recent, and we're working out what the strategy is around that. So yeah, I mean, I'm not in the circle that decides those things, actually, the political circle and the others, so I'll hear when you hear, probably. Sure.
Well, let's talk about the best advice you ever got.
The best advice I ever got was from my mum. She's a very quiet person. She's a migrant to this country. English was not her first language. She migrated here in the 60s. There was a big industrial boom in Birmingham. They needed workers. Very stoical, quite quiet person, quite religious. And she, to be honest, she didn't even speak that much. Like, she was a very quiet person, like really nice mother, but very quiet. And there was just one time when I had a falling out with someone, a family member. I had a big family, and she just took me aside and said, your voice counts. Never, ever feel that your voice doesn't count. And it was such a small thing. And I think I must have been about 9 or 10, but it has stayed with me forever. And actually, obviously it's hard to say where I would be if she hadn't said it. But if you look at my entire life, it's so relevant to my work now and before Extinction Rebellion.
I found that people who have felt that they were silenced at some point in their life very early on have difficulty staying silent for the rest of their lives.
Yeah, it becomes a rebellious act just to be yourself.
It does. I had a speech impediment when I was a kid. I had to go to a special school. I had a lot of speech therapy to be even just as whatever I say now, the horrible word salad that comes out of my mouth. At least people can understand the consonants and the vowels. But yeah, I totally understand when someone is trying to silence you. Was this family member trying just to keep you quiet, or just not paying attention to you? Or
I can't even remember exactly what it was, but it was my sister. But I had 3 sisters. There were a lot of fallings out, as you can imagine.
Oh, yeah.
And I can't even remember exactly what it was, but it's something with my sister. And she was a lot older, and so it was just sort of, she's told me to do this and I just have to do it, and I really didn't want to, and I was just told, stop arguing about it, and that was my response. It's what little girls are often taught, especially back then, just do as you're told, be quiet. And so yeah, my mum saying that really gave me a slightly different perspective. And it's funny because I'm sure she said other things at other times, and I'm sure my dad did, and I'm sure my siblings did, but that one thing really stuck for some reason. I think it's probably the thing I most needed to hear, and the thing that's been most relevant in life, but I've just never forgotten it.
So how's that influenced or informed your own parenting?
So it's interesting actually, because I founded this Extinction Rebellion newspaper, the Hourglass, and a lot of that is about platforming different voices. So I always make sure I have different people from different communities. We have a whole youth page, and actually when the first issue launched, I thought, we've got so and so writer, we've got Jonathan Pye, like well-known names, people are going to be really excited about it, and they were. But actually a lot of the feedback I had was about the youth page. So we gave a whole page over to Youth Voice is what we called it, and we had 3 young writers on there from different youth groups, and that actually had so much impact. It was amazing really, because I think people saw it and thought, why don't all papers have this? This is great, actually, and they're all like really smart, young individuals with something really important to say. So it was interesting, because to me that just seemed like an obvious thing. And I also tried to get an Indigenous voice in there, and tried to get multiple different, so to me it seemed obvious. But then again, I was told that you're really sort of amplifying these voices, but I don't feel like that's me specifically thinking I need to do this work, I need to do that. I'm just literally going, we should have these voices, because that reflects society, and that reflects who's going to read the paper, and it reflects the many different views that are out there.
It also creates a really good farm team for the movement too, because it allows people to acknowledge at a very young age that their voices matter, and that there is a home for them within the movement that you're in.
And you know what's interesting? You say their voices matter, of course they do, but they were the hardest voices to find, and Indigenous people actually couldn't find one. And I went through multiple routes and multiple people saying, I can definitely find you someone. We have contact with people, and actually finding someone. And I actually went to a conference in London, because it was on at the same time as me, and I went, and there was a tribe there from Brazil, and I said, could one of you write something? And actually thought, this is definitely going to come through, and I still didn't get anything. And I had the email, and I was emailing saying, could you get this article to me? And I never heard anything back. So actually sometimes those voices as well are the hardest to get, either partly maybe because they're not used to expressing their voice, or partly they've got other factors that they're dealing with, and obviously with young people that was going to happen, because they're not used to working to tight deadlines or whatever. None of them were writers specifically, but I really chased, and there were a couple as well that didn't come through. And then I've actually found someone who's a parent who makes videos for XR, and I said, you've got a daughter, will she write something? And she wrote a great. So it all came together, but it took a little bit of extra work. Whereas, all the ones that I asked of adults, probably 99% of those articles just came in, and they came in on time. So there are always, more obstacles, I think, as well, than people realise. But then to me, that it's even more important, because that means we're definitely not hearing their voices, and everybody's got something valuable to say, so let's give them the space to say it.
And I've heard different people. And this is not the first time you've heard this criticism of Extinction Rebellion, is that it's basically a bunch of white people exercising their privilege.
Yeah, so we're having a lot of discussions about this, and it's a valid response, especially. So I've been involved in the Green movement for a long time. I was in Camp for Climate Action 10 years ago, civil disobedience, closing down banks, things like that. That's what we're up to. I've been involved in Greenpeace and in the local Friends of the Earth group, and it's always been a very privileged, movement. And I was at a conference a few weeks ago, and I was speaking to one of the organisers, and she said when she lived in Mexico, the group she was in there was all white people. It was just this question of what is going on there, So it is a problem, but it's not just an Extinction Rebellion problem, it's a systemic society-wide problem. But what I'm interested in, and I'm not going to claim that we have any of the answers and we're magically going to fix it, but I would say there's a lot of response to that within this movement. There's a lot of people saying, well, how do we fix it? There's a lot of people wanting to fix it. I've literally had people message me and say, how can we be allies? If there's a problem, how can we, so we're talking about, so we already have things in place, we have the basic principles about treating people equally. We have anti-oppression workshops people voluntarily go to. It's 2-3 hours of actually going through the work. It's run by Carl and Lima. If you look up Carl Lamb's work, he's been doing this for, years before XR. Is really knowledgeable about and so there's questions of, should we have that more in the kind of structural DNA of XR to make sure that everybody's accesses it? Do we need to or someone was saying we could have ally workshops. I didn't even know they existed, allyship workshops, to I think XR Scotland has them already in the youth group. Again, they know stuff that I don't know, that they've maybe grown up with more than I did, because things are a bit more together in some ways now. So there's a lot of stuff we can do, and we are doing it, but it's not going to be an easy fix. It's not going to happen overnight. And there's still a question of, can you really fix these issues when everything around you is steeped in it? That's the first thing you learn in anti-oppression work, is that everybody is just steeped in this stuff, and it all it's really hard to step out of it. And even I could accidentally, because I might have more privilege than another person of color in this country, might know how to have more privilege and be more in a more of an oppressor role than them, because it's all just so, and that's coming from a really working class background, from and as a woman of color. And even stuff like, we've made mistakes. So when we first started, we were working on this before the press was calling it out, but we made mistakes. So one thing that I actually helped with that made me feel really bad was like platforming more people of color as speakers. So I was helping, like coaching them. Like I don't have a lot of official coaching, but I've had experience. So I was helping, or like giving them briefings before they go on and things, on TV shows and things. And actually the level of hatred towards some of these people when you're platforming people of color, we were not prepared for it. And we had a woman of color, have death threats, which was just so shocking, which again was like, okay, we don't exist in a bubble. So if we are doing that, it's not about just platforming, it's about protecting as well, and knowing and making sure they understand that there's that added risk that our white male speakers don't have, to that degree. And also so many things. I could talk all day about it. But what I would say is we're working very hard on being more inclusive, and I would say that of all the movements I've been in, it's the most promising. And I think people don't realize this, because they think, so like one thing I brought up in Exile was that when I used to work in an office, you'd get issues like this sometimes, but there would be a boss, right? You'd go to a boss or you'd go to an HR department and they'd fix it. But actually it's just a superficial fix. Like they just tell someone don't bully, or they just tell someone don't steal someone's work. It's not actually dealing with the issue where that person's using their privilege over you. Whereas what we're actually trying to do is unpick that. And I don't even know if it's possible, but to me, just seeing that we're trying to do the work, and I've said this to people and I've had journalists say it's still not good enough, why do you still look and we still have issues in Exile. Some people hyper focusing on arrest as a strategy, which they just need to stop doing. But again, that's that we're having conversations with them and trying to work out how can we make you understand that this is not, that's great that you're speaking of your prison experience and you were treated well, but let's look at the statistics that show that a lot of people from minority groups actually have many different issues with that prison system.
Definitely. You raise a very good point that in a business environment, their business is to keep the peace and to make sure the work keeps going, while XR, you're really trying to change hearts and minds. And that is by far a more long-term goal than anything else.
Yeah, and for me, I think this is one of the things that gets lost when people think it is just about filling up prisons, or it is just about, XYZ thing. Actually, yeah, that is in the strategy. But if you look at things like our regenerative culture, it's actually about this. It's about the inner work. It's about how can we create something that's better? Because otherwise, aren't we just going to wreak havoc on the world the way that the rest of the, the way that the ruling parties have done? Like, how can we actually try to make this better? And there's a lot of people in this who believe the exact same thing, and there's some people who are just in it saying let's just fill the prisons and that'll work, but there's quite a lot of people saying, well, actually, if we can make these structural changes, we can, it's like laying foundations for the future generations, so that even when it comes to things like food security issues which are coming, rise of fascism, just things being more difficult, they might have some community and like strong foundations and like connections that will help them through it, some resilience. If we're learning a better way to deal with conflict, there might be that, and maybe it's just really idealistic, but I think it's the best we can hope for. I just saw a map the other day that was released showing some of the areas that are going underwater. Have you seen that yet?
I've seen a couple of maps. Yeah.
It's terrible. So the latest one that I saw, like half of my town will be underwater. The roads will be closed, and I don't know what you know about over here, but when we have in the UK, when there is something like it snows, like we don't get snow that often, right? Honestly, like everything just closes. You can't use trains. I once took a train in the snow and it took me 18 hours for what should have been a 5-hour journey, because I kept getting on trains. The driver wasn't there. The tracks weren't working. The roads were closed. We can't cope. We don't have the infrastructure. We just don't. And last year when we had a blizzard in March, I was living on a hill and the gritters couldn't get around that hill to grit it. So I was basically snowed in because I couldn't get down the hill. It was just a sheet of ice. Sure. 2 whole days until people actually went out and helped to clear it, and it's quite dangerous. It's very slippery. And then went to the shop, and there was hardly any food because the trucks hadn't got through. And I thought, wow, this was only 2 days. You know, we're talking about all these regions by 2050 being underwater. What can we salvage? If we can't prevent that now, you know, we can try and prevent it getting worse, but we can't just stop it. So what can we do that provides, you know, making sure people feed each other and look after each other? That's all the regenerative culture stuff.
You know, and you raise a couple of really good points. Is that, you know, you have we really need non-government groups that have the long term in mind, because government, as you well know, they just work on the election cycle. So very short-sighted, very narrow focus, and they just want to kick the can down the road a lot of the times. And really, these non-governmental groups to put pressure on governments to do the right thing over the long term, very necessary.
It's interesting as well because it's really working over here. It seems like it's working. So there was a poll just recently, literally just the other day, a few days ago, which found that most Britons want to vote on climate policy. So like it would sway who they vote for, is what that research said, which actually seeing that was just phenomenal. Like this happened really quickly from people not really caring and not knowing the issues to say this is actually oppressing. And so we've got some parties coming out with some really promising, you know, I think that the leading party is sort of saying 2030 that they will try and get emissions down by, which, you know, yeah, maybe they wouldn't hit the target, but aiming for that 20 years sooner than what the current government's saying, that's great, because we will see that policy happening now while they're there, instead of someone else will deal with it later. It's just paying lip service. So yeah, so that's from keeping that pressure on and keeping it in the public eye, just keeping the disruption, which keeps it in the public eye, makes people think, okay, yeah, you know, even if we don't agree with their methods or whatever, this is a real emergency. And we've had, you know, just the number of people now and newspaper outlets as well, who a year ago were calling us alarmists and now using the term climate emergency. In fact, just the other day, there's a woman in Cambridge who went to court. She graffitied a council building, and she went to court and argued that she did it because there's an emergency. And I mean, they always do, right? But this judge actually ruled, it's the first time it's happened, where he said it is completely fair, because it was that vandalism was allowed under the law because it was raising awareness of like the equivalent of smashing a building. If your house is on fire and you need to get to like smashing, that was the equivalent. I don't understand a lot about law, but I just read the article and was like, this is fantastic. And hopefully more, and that's judges, right? So that's judges waking up to the reality. And he used the term climate emergency. So keeping that pressure on is causing a lot of shifts in society, which we need across, not just in governments, but just across all institutions, really.
I think that's a great place to end. Xeon Lights, thanks for coming on The Best Advice.
Thanks for having me.
For sharing some great advice. That was fantastic. Where can people find you online?
I'm on Twitter at XeonTree.
Well, thanks again.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.